Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just going to make sure everyone can hear me before I start.
Yes, we can hear you, Alhamdulillah.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah wahda. Wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da. Amma ba'd. قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في القرآن الكريم الطيبات للطيبين والطيبون للطيبات صدق الله العظيم. So alhamdulillah, it's been a long day in a good way. We had the opportunity to spend many hours together online with different ulama and different speakers today to be able to remember the Prophet ﷺ and to remember different incidents of the Prophet ﷺ's life, characteristics of his that we hope to embody. And when Mufti Saab had asked me to speak tonight, he actually said that I'm sort of free to speak on whatever I would like. And it's about 10:45 right now. I don't think we're gonna go to 11:30. Allahu alam, we might end up going to 11:30, but my intention is to keep it short. This is a youth talk, although usually anytime there's a youth talk, that means that there's non-youth on here as well. But the assumption is that there's only youth on. My topic in my mind and my heart is one that I think is necessary for the youth, especially in context of the world today and in context of what we've been speaking about regarding the Prophet ﷺ today. However, at the same time, a person might listen to the first part and think, oh, this doesn't apply to me. But I think it's applicable to anyone, no matter what stage they are in their life. Just a couple of days ago, my wife and I were sitting and talking, and we're talking because she had a talk to give to a sisters program in Milwaukee, virtually, but nonetheless a sisters program in Milwaukee. And it was speaking about marriage. And marriage is something that obviously is not required within the deen, but it's recommended within the deen. And when we were talking about it, we oftentimes before either of us gives a talk, we usually discuss what the talk will be on, and that way we can bounce ideas off one another. And what we began to talk about was this concept of marriage is so different today. We live in a world now where genders are no longer defined. There's a whole questioning of binary relationships. There's all these things that have sort of left their traditional and conventional understanding. And so it's hard sometimes to speak about topics like this because inevitably someone's going to be offended. Inevitably someone's going to be hurt. And that's not my intention tonight. My intention is from a very basic Islamic understanding to express the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Adam alayhi salam was given paradise and was given the glory and joys of paradise, to give the comforts of paradise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite all that Adam alayhi salam had, still added one extra element to perfect that experience within paradise for Adam alayhi salam. And that was the addition of a spouse. Adam alayhi salam was not made with a spouse. He was created from dust, from dirt. And he was created and molded and formed. And then he was in paradise and he was experiencing paradise. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Adam alayhi salam was asleep, then created Hawa alayhi salam, the wife of Adam alayhi salam, from his rib. And when he awoke, he had found her as a partner to enjoy paradise. So from the very beginning of our human history, not human history on this earth, but human history in general, we see the presence of a husband, of a wife, meaning of a married couple. And then Allah Ta'ala, when He speaks about this in Quran, He mentions, Ya ayyuhan nasu ittaqu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum min nafsin wahida wa khalaqa minha zawjaha wa batha minhuma rijalan kathiran nisaa wattaqullah. That, O mankind, have consciousness of the one who made you from one individual. And then from that, individual created a spouse for that person. And then from those two made many, many children. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has even spoken in Quran about this idea of husbands and wives. And He's given different descriptions. He's given a description of within Quran that we have "Hunna libasun lakum wa antum libasun lahun," that we're garments for one another. We're protective coverings. We're coverings of warmth. We're coverings of beauty for one another. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned that this union by which we come together is supposed to be one of sakina and of muwadda and rahmah. That it's one of peace and tranquility, and it's one of love, and it's one of mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned in the Quran that when people are paired together, it's the pure people are given to the pure people. And so now when we're looking at this union, this marriage that exists between husband and wife in this world, what we find is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned it repeatedly within Quran and has made it a sunnah of the prophets in general. Yes, there are some prophets who are not married. We know Yahya alayhi salam, sayyidan wa hasura wa nabiyyan min as-salihin. Hasura, he chose to remain away from marriage. Isa alayhi salam, who is not married, will return back to this earth and then will marry. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the presence of marriage within our life as something that's praiseworthy. But though many people speak about gender relationships or gender relations, I should say, and relationships in general, in a world where Tinder sort of rules the day, and you have, the Ashley Madison websites out there that completely undermine this beautiful relationship that Allah Ta'ala has prescribed in the Quran, that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has encouraged within Hadith. We as Muslims, we uphold the sanctified union and trust, and what we look to do is we look to see, how does a person maximize this opportunity? I've been an educator now for, by Allah's tawfiq, for almost 2 decades. And as an educator, one thing I've noticed is that if you look at any consistent temptation within the lives of my students, it's not wealth. Wealth is there, but it's not really a temptation within the lives of students. It's not necessarily the main temptation that has constantly existed within the lives of my students. And I think students in general is just the temptation of the opposite gender and the temptation of lustful gatherings. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gave us an outlet, and this outlet is known as marriage. And within this outlet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided a very interesting description of Quran. He mentioned that the impure people are determined for the impure people. And he mentioned that the people of purity are determined for the people of purity. And so my wife and I were talking the other day. The first thing we're talking about, actually the first thing that has to be mentioned, in which we spoke about as well, is that marriage is not mandatory. And I mention this because what is marriage? Marriage, if you look at the books of fiqh, it is that act of worship, it's that act, I should say, that comes at the tail end of ibadat, or at the very beginning of mu'amalat. It comes at the tail end of the sections of worship, at the very beginning of the section of interactions between people, between creations. It comes from at the end of the rights of Allah and at the beginning of the rights of creation. And it's placed strategically there because the fact that this particular act of worship is in many ways sort of that merging point between both. And it opens our eyes to one reality, and that is that marriage, the purpose is not necessarily to have children. Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did not have children with all the spouses that he married. And the Sahaba radiallahu anhum did not necessarily have children. And a person's worth is not determined by having children. If someone happens to have a marriage in which there's no children, it's not a problem. That's not necessarily going to determine a successful marriage versus a failing marriage. But what we do see is that we see that in marriage, the term of marriage we see in the Arabic language of nikah, and it's also known as an ahad and an aqd. What we see is that all acts of worship, they have pretty much two types of definitions. We see, for example, when we look at zakah, zakah is going to mean more literally a means of purification. But linguistically, what does it refer to? It refers to giving a set amount of wealth if qualified, so other people are able to have a respectable standard of living. If we look at other acts of worship like salah, if we look at hajj, these things don't necessarily mean, the circumambulation of the Kaaba and performing certain acts at a certain time. They don't necessarily mean standing up and moving the body in certain directions or positions such that you're able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Actually, you see that they have different meanings. It means direction, it means intention, it means having an intent for something. Som doesn't necessarily mean just fasting. Som means abstention, to stay away from things. But when a person stays away from things, that particular act is done why? To gain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I'm staying away from things. Why? So that I can make my heart solely connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why it is. Because there are people who don't eat and drink. Rasulullah ﷺ has mentioned in different hadith how many people who fast get nothing from their fast except for just hunger. Rasulullah ﷺ has mentioned within hadith that Allah has no need for a person who has just kept himself starving. That's not the purpose of fasting. The purpose of fasting is to what? To begin to abstain from different things so that we can connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the purpose. The purpose of charity is to purify ourselves to gain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And similarly, when we look at the act of nikah, we looked at this act of aqd. In aqd, it means to bind yourself to something. It's also a contractual agreement which refers to marriage as well, aqdun nikah. But what we're trying to actually do is through this relationship, bind ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're taking a relationship in this world that will teach us to love Allah more and bind ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the successful marriage is that marriage that through that marriage an individual grows closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite of what happens in the marriage. A marriage might quote unquote fail from a dunyawi standard. Like someone might end in divorce. It happens. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum had marriages that end in divorce. But through that relationship, they're able to get a new understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at the greatest example of this is Asya radiallahu anha in her marriage to Fir'aun. It ended in a very, very, very horrible, from a dunyawi standard, from a worldly standard way. She was killed by her husband in the most gruesome of ways. But through that marriage, what did she achieve? She achieved a connection to her love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what happens as she's passing away? It's evident. She makes the dua, رَبِّ ابْنِي لِي بَيْتًا رَبِّ ابْنِي لِي عِنْدَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ. That, oh my Lord, build for me near you a house in paradise. Not just the house in paradise, but near you. Because she did not establish for herself through this marriage a love for things, or a love for neighborhoods, or a love for reward. She established through this marriage what? A love for Allah. So that marriage was successful. It was successful because through that marriage, she was able to subsequently what? Draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the purpose of marriage. And this is why some individuals, when they marry, when they have the opportunity to marry, they choose not to marry because they feel that their connection to Allah Ta'ala will be stronger through other means. This is why Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayhi did not marry. He didn't marry because his connection through Allah Ta'ala, through service of the deen and through knowledge is going to be greater. We see Imam Nawawi rahmatullahi alayhi did not marry. Why? His connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the service of the deen and submission through his knowledge was going to be stronger than his connection to Allah through marriage. So the first thing I want all of us to understand is that why do we even look at these relationships? We look at every relationship in this world for the purpose of saying, how will it grow me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Just that, and that's with everything, not just relationship with people. Why do I get a job? Because this job will allow me to submit best to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why do I have a friendship? Because it'll allow me to submit to Allah ta'ala. Maybe through this friendship, I'll be encouraged to come to the masjid. Maybe through this friendship, I'll be encouraged to donate. Maybe through this friendship, I'll be encouraged to go and do social work within my community, etc., etc. Everything that we do, even the purchase of garments, even the purchase of food, is this food halal and tayyib? Meaning, will it get me closer to Allah Ta'ala? Will this garment get me closer to Allah? Will I have pride and be busy in vain pursuits because of this garment? And so everything that we do is just another connection to Allah Ta'ala. If when we're about to embark on that particular journey, we take a step back as we should and make the intention, recognize I can't make a positive intention here to get me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we drop it. And for some people, they saw marriage, and Imam Nawawi rahmatullah alayh, he was not willing to fulfill a sunnah and violate a wajib. He could not violate the rights of his spouse, fulfill the sunnah of marrying her, but then not fulfill her rights because he was so busy in his knowledge. So that's the first thing we have to recognize, that am I these relationships am I is it for Allah? And honestly, if a person is telling me, look, I got a girl and she wakes me up for tahajjud every night, but we're not married yet, that relationship is not getting you closer to Allah. But brother, she wakes me up for tahajjud every night. I guarantee in 95% of these situations, what happens? That the moment the actual marriage takes place, she's not waking up for tahajjud anymore. Shaitan was just having her call you at that time to further the illicitness of that particular relationship and that connection. But the moment it became halal, Shaitan lost interest. And what did he do? Doesn't want you to speak to her anymore. So now you sleep through that time. The purpose of every relationship is Allah. Is it going to get me closer to Allah? And this is how Rasulullah was. Every relationship he had was determined that will it get me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if it didn't, he would stay away from it. That was everything in this world. And so we have to ask ourselves, in my pursuit for the opposite gender, my pursuit for this particular person, my pursuit for this ideal, is it getting me closer to Allah Ta'ala? And if you're a mother's a student and you're in your second year and the best one was I had an 8th grade student. And if you're listening, I apologize. I had an 8th grade student who came to me. He's like, oh, brother Saad, I found the one. Bro, you're in 8th grade. You didn't find the one. You have like another 10 years till you get married. It's not going to happen. But convince himself, oh, I found the one. I think I found the one I'm going to marry. The reality is that those moments are only going to distract the individual from going closer to Allah Ta'ala. So see first that, am I doing this for Allah? Then secondly, whenever that time comes where I'm ready to take that step for the sake of Allah Ta'ala, because some people marriage is wajib for them, some people it's sunnah for them. Then see, okay, now in Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in different places, I'm not going to mention all the places, I'm mentioning one in particular. He's described people who are paired off for one another, that they're connected, that they're sort of given to one another. And that is the people who are pure for the people who are pure, and the people who are impure for the people who are impure. And why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pair off these people? Well, before we even get into why, and we can see for productive society, let's actually look at the bigger question. No one here, if I were to ask, like, look, what type of person you want to marry, she would say, I want to marry a guy who who would cheat on me, or who's had multiple partners before. No guy would say, I want to find a girl who had multiple partners before, or who would cheat. No one would say that. Everyone wants a pure person. Even if they messed up and had partners before, they want to eventually marry a pure person. While Allah Ta'ala mentions that the pure are for the pure. So while we strive for a pure person, the question we have to ask ourselves is, am I pure for the person I'm going to marry? I can marry, if in my case, a pure wife. And I'll fulfill what the verse has to say. And I'll fulfill what the hadith encouraged me to do, to marry a person of good character, to marry a person for religion, so on and so forth. But what about her? Am I expecting her in her marriage to me to violate what the Quran says or to violate what the hadith says? If I don't want that to happen, or if I want to be amongst those individuals who strive, who allow for my wife's first steps in this particular relationship to be successful, then I have to make myself pure for her first. Or for the sisters, you have to make yourselves pure for the guy first. If not, then our first step in the marriage, I want people to think about this. If we're entering into a marriage where we're not pure, then our first step is pretty much telling our spouse, that you're entering on the wrong foot. Why? Because the descriptions in Quran for couples to marry a pure person towards a pure person, or in the hadith, a person of good character, a person of deen, etc., that person who's marrying us is not being fulfilled. And that's frightening, that we've led that person to take a faulty first step. And so the point in bringing this up is, before we start looking at whom we can find, we should ask, what are we going to be, or who are we going to be for others? Am I that pure person that someone would want to marry? Am I that person who fulfills that description in Quran? Am I that person who fulfills the descriptions in Hadith? And if I'm not, how do I become that person? I'm not saying don't marry. I'm saying that, what do we do? And it's a lifelong journey. I can't say I'm the pure person my wife should marry, because we've been married, alhamdulillah, for almost 18 years. She can't undo 18 years of our life. It doesn't work that way. Rather, I have to constantly be asking myself, even after the nikah was done, that am I that pure person that she's supposed to be married to? And if the answer is no, then I have to push myself towards it. And if you're in a position where you are married, then from right now, not from tomorrow morning, not tomorrow after Fajr, etc., from right now, we have to say, I want my wife to fulfill, my husband to fulfill what the Quran Hadith says. And by what? Making myself pure, so she or he connects himself or herself to a pure person. And if we're not married, then even easier. We take time out now, we take a step back, and we cut out those things that are causing us not to fulfill the descriptions of the people of purity. And so many people now are striving for the sake of fulfilling lust and fulfilling desires, that they're forgetting that eventually, when we settle down, am I going to be that person that he or she should have married in order to have married a pure person? It's actually very frightening when we think about the fact that in any area of this world, if we mix something pure with something impure, we would see it. I'll give you an example. The other day, I take my car. I have a Prius, 2012 Prius. I had to take it to a mechanic because every couple months my light bulbs burn out, and I couldn't figure out why. So finally, they said, "Look, when you change the light bulbs, are your fingertips touching the light bulb?" I'm like, "Probably not, but maybe." They said, "No, the oils on your finger will cause this bulb to malfunction. The bulb has a certain purity. The dirt and the oils from your finger will cause the bulb to malfunction. So you can never let those touch." Give another example. If a person is, puts on a white thobe or white garment for Jummah and is walking out, and as they're walking out on a rainy day, a car drives by and splatters a couple droplets of mud onto that white garment, even though they're minuscule in comparison to the entire white garment, everyone's going to notice it right away. It will not look right. The person will go back in the home and change. If I were to have, a glass of pure milk, and I taking out for my son or daughter to drink from, and as I'm pouring the milk into the cup, I don't recognize that the glass is a little shard that's chipped, and I cut my finger and a drop of blood comes inside. I'm going to immediately discard the milk. I'm not going to say, well, there's 8 ounces of milk and only 1 drop of blood, so it's not a problem. Immediately, I know I'm going to have what? Completely ruin that milk. I need to go and now get some fresh milk for my child. Or anything, wudu. If we're going to do wudu and there happens to be in this bowl that we're doing wudu from, there happens to be a drop of urine, for example, we can't utilize it either. And so everything in this world, we see that if it's not pure, if there's some sort of defect or there's some sort of impurity that comes into it, it ruins its performance. You take gas. I remember just recently, over the summer, I was mowing my lawn. And as I was mowing the lawn, I was tired and I ran out of gasoline. So I went and to the shed and I pulled out the gas canister and I started pouring it in. And just briefly, I started pouring it in. And then I'm like, oh my God, I removed the oil cap, not the gas cap. So I realized I put it where the oil should go. Then I have to stop. And then I try to start the lawnmower. It wouldn't work anymore. A small amount a fuel came where the oil should be, and it wouldn't work anymore. I had to drain the oil out and then start it up again, and then put oil in and start it up again. Why? Because when something is meant to be pure and exclusive and impurity comes into it, then it ruins its performance. So the spouse I'm marrying is so good and so pure and so righteous. And here I come as someone who lacks purity. I could potentially ruin the performance of this marriage, which doesn't mean that we don't get married. It means that at every moment we think to ourselves, how can I maintain purity? How can I be a person? Because what's going to happen is that there's going to be a result of that marriage. That's what, it's either children or it's going to be volunteerism in the community. It's going to be some result of that marriage. And if it's not pure input, often it won't be pure output. So today we heard, and subhanAllah, I think it was Maulana Junaid who was speaking about it today, early in the day today, or he was speaking about the end of Surah Inshirah. That's فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَبْ. That even for a person who spends all day, like the Prophet ﷺ, in service of the people, then what? Then at night when we're free, إِذَا فَرَغْتَ, then what should we do? We should force ourselves into worship and submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now there's many wisdoms written behind this. And from the wisdoms that are mentioned over here, from the wisdoms that are mentioned, one of the wisdoms actually seen the life of one of our greats, Khalaf, Maulana Ilyas rahmatullahi alayh. When he would go to the people and interact with them regularly, then what would happen is that the people, after he came back from going on Jamaat, for example, he would come back, he would go to Maulana Raipuri rahmatullahi alayh's khanqa. Why? Because so much time was spent interacting with people. Now what's going to particularly happen is that the effects of people can come upon him as well. So then he would spend time purifying himself. Because the nature of making a relationship work, be it a relationship of deen, a relationship of marriage, or a relationship for work, everyone has to be pure. Look, if you're at work and your intention is to perform so well that you overthrow your boss and now you get put in that position, the boss gets removed from the position, that work is never going to go well, because eventually the underlying intentions will become clear. But if your intention is to serve the community, serve the company, and serve the institution, or serve the school, wherever you're working, and it so happens that you're promoted to that position, and maybe that person's moved somewhere else, it won't be the same, because even then a person can say very openly, I didn't know, I didn't expect this to happen. Usually what happens is that if there's faulty intentions, then a person is affected. The whole mechanism is affected negatively. So the point of this discussion today, which I'm wrapping up right now, is that before you start looking into others, look to yourself. And before we start, meaning people who are married, looking into others, meaning what's going wrong with the marriage, look to ourselves. And when we look to ourselves, if we're finding faults within ourselves, oftentimes, even from the spiritual realm, what happens is that a person's wrongdoings and faults will cause a reverberating effect, that their lack of spirituality will cause an effect elsewhere. And begin to work on the self. What does that mean? Number one, it means before we even start looking to do good deeds, we should start looking to cut out evil deeds. Before we start to look to do good deeds, we should start looking to cut out evil deeds. Because if you fulfill the basics of the deen, but abstain from sin, already you'll be a person of paradise. So first is abstaining from sin. And look, all sin is problematic. But the sin that often worries people the most is that sin in which someone else's rights are compromised. Like, if I don't pray, that's horrible. But Allah can forgive me, although I should always be praying. But if I'm doing something, if I'm not lowering my gaze to a woman, for example, I'm violating her rights. I'm violating the right of her spouse or her whatever her caretaker. If I for example, don't fast, that's horrible. If I'm backbiting, now I'm violating the right of another individual whose honor has to be kept protected in my life through me. And now I violate that person. So the sins have to first be cut out. And yes, even the sin of being with someone that we should not be with has to be cut out. Because even if, look, forget ourselves for a moment, that other person whom we declare so much care and love for, we're setting up for her pathway or his pathway a direct route to the hellfire. We don't want to do that. So we have to. So, oh, brother, I can't break her heart. If I do, she'll cut herself. She'll commit suicide. Trust me, most of the time they don't. And wouldn't you rather save her from hell, save him from hell? Brother, we've gone too far. There's no such thing as going too far. You didn't kill 100 people. That person was forgiven. You didn't do every sin in the book, which Gifan did, and he was forgiven. Literally, the hadith mentions that for the first example I gave, that the man who killed 99 people sought advice from a person of piety. That person asking is, can I achieve Allah's mercy? Can He forgive me? He said, you killed 99 people, you're done. So the person said, okay, 100. He kills him, makes it 100. And now he feels remorse later, and he goes and he finds someone else, person of piety but knowledge as well. Is there any hope for me? The person says, who can stand between Allah's mercy and His servant? But you need to leave your bad influence, leave to this other city. The person, as he's migrating to a new city, passes away. And when he passes away, what do we see? We see that because of his sin, the angels of hell came to collect his body. But because of his intention to do good, the angels of heaven came to collect his body. And in one narration, we see that Allah Ta'ala had said to decide this dispute of where he should go, measure between the two lands. If he's close to the place he was intending to go, then put him to heaven. If he's close to the place from where he departed, he's going to hell. When they measure, he's close to the place to which he was intending to arrive to. However, in another narration, in Ibn Majah, we see that it wasn't even the angel of hell. Iblis himself came to collect that body. And we see that in one of the Sahih narrations of this particular hadith, that he was actually closer to the land from which he departed. He should have gone to hell. But Allah loved his intention so much that He said, O earth, grow further, which means the land from where he came moved further from his body. And O earth, O land that he was going to come to, then move closer to him. And the earth literally shifted such that he came closer to the place that he was intending to go, and Allah put him to heaven, even though he died further from that spot. Kifl, a man in Bani Israel, who every sin he did he did every sin, and then the sins were written on the doorway as well. So people used to come and see, oh, he did this sin, this sin. What happens one night? He pays a woman to spend the night with him, and when he approaches her to fulfill his desire, she begins to weep, and he says, "What? I didn't make you do this. I paid you. Everything was, legitimate contract." And she mentions that I only did this because my family is starving. We're in need of wealth. And I've never done something like this before. So he's so overwhelmed by this. The people of purity. Remember how he mentioned the purity of a person, how strong it can be? That it was so strong that Kifl said, you never did this before? Leave and keep the money. And that night he turned to Allah making dua. He died that same night. And when the people came in the morning to look at his door, what's written there? What did they see? Verily, Kifl has been forgiven. Verily, Allah has forgiven Kifl. So there is hope. We have to take that first step to walk away from whatever sin is tying us down. Then the second steps would be to begin to do good deeds. And how do we do that? By finding good company and good physical company, like actual brick and mortar institutions, and good spiritual company, meaning actual people. But that, we can talk about that later. So there's a few minutes for question and answer. I told you guys I'm only going to go about a half hour. So if you have questions, feel free to ask. If not, take advantage of praying a few extra rak'ah before going to sleep, asking Allah for forgiveness, turning to Him, myself first and foremost, in order to fix whatever we've done wrong and to become a person of purity. And never lose hope. The people who woke up to kill the Prophet ﷺ were the ones who went to their graves loving the Prophet ﷺ and dying as shuhada. The Sahaba, many of them were idol worshippers who hated the Prophet ﷺ, but Allah changed their lives, and He will do the same to us. We have to have complete confidence and faith in that. So, Farhan Bhai, is there any questions? If not, inshallah, we'll just end.
I didn't see any questions on the YouTube chat.
Okay, excellent. Then inshallah, we'll end.
Inshallah.
Okay, Jazakallahu Khairun, Moana. I will let everyone
Wa
go.
yakum. Jazakallahu Khairun for your time.
No, my pleasure. Alhamdulillah. Okay, take care, everyone. Assalamu
Inshallah.
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.